Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's Africa editor, Géraud, joining us from the beautiful island of Mauritius. A very good, I think, morning to you in Mauritius.
Morning to me, Eric, today.
Yes.
Morning to me and afternoon to you.
Yes, in the afternoon here in Southeast Asia. Very excited to talk about, continue our conversation about what we've been talking about in terms of the media in Zambia. Lots of action this week in Zambia, particularly over the Kafue River disaster that has been unfolding over the past, let's say, about 4 or 5 months now since February.
4 or 5 months now, yes.
Yeah. So let me just, and Géraud, I want to get your take on this and have you help us contextualize what's been going on. Basically, a brouhaha started last week when the U.S. ambassador to Zambia, he characterized the spill, which was about 50,000 liters of acidic water that was leaked into the Kafue River after a tailings dam broke, which is one of the dams on a mine. This was a Sino Metals mine, and Sino Metals is a Chinese state-owned company, and he called it one of the worst environmental disasters ever. He then made an announcement to withdraw U.S. personnel from the region. In my view, and I'm not really sure, that felt more like a symbolic gesture. Not sure how many U.S. personnel were actually in that region, given that most U.S. personnel are probably in the Lusaka area around the embassy. Well, the Chinese embassy and the foreign ministry in Beijing did not take well to that. They issued a blistering statement criticizing the U.S., and caught in the middle of all this is the Zambian government, who's trying to say, well, everything's under control, we are cleaning it up, and President Hakainde Hichilema tried to give some reassuring statements that the situation isn't as bad as the U.S. is making it out to be. Géraud, what do we make of all of this and the back and forth between the U.S., China, and even Hichilema?
I'm not really surprised from the take from the U.S. Embassy on that situation. Historically, as I was telling you before we started the show, the U.S. Embassy in Lusaka has already had different difficult relationship with the Zambian government, even the former regime, and even this one as well. So it's not really surprising to me. But in all those debates, what's really surprising to me is the fact that both the statement coming from the U.S. Embassy, did not really provide much more information in terms of data or what sources of information they use or what kind of tests they run themselves to be able to provide us solid background. We had when you read the statement, it's just like, yes, we believe this and that, and you're like, what did you use? What was the statement? And the same thing also in terms of rebuttal coming from the Chinese foreign affairs minister or coming from Zambia. None of the side are providing us with real data or real information to allow us to say whose one is telling the truth or which one is lying. We are really in that space where it's a narrative debate. It's a very much narrative debate. And like, yes, it's so polluted that we have to evacuate our people. So based on what are the numbers? What are the measurements that you use to do that? Okay, it's safe, but based on what? What are the measurement that you're using? So we all in the middle have to pick side in a battle of narrative where, let's say, Kafue has become that geopolitical narrative. We saw that when it was about Africom, former head of Africom during his hearing on the Senate in Washington, where Kafue came up. China polluting environment in Zambia and all of that. So Kafue has become that talking point into the geopolitical debate that we see around U.S. and China engagement in Africa. So yeah, I'm not really surprised that it became.
Yeah, it's certainly become a talking point in Washington. In fact, one of the new hallmarks of the narrative about the Chinese in Africa that Americans now are often referencing is this mining disaster. It's also been an issue in the Zambian media as well. And if you recall from a couple of weeks ago, we did a show highlighting a documentary by the independent news outlet, and it's a national newspaper, News Diggers, and they did a documentary called Part 1. They say a Part 2 is coming. We haven't seen a Part 2. China, the Good, the Bad, and the Dangerous. That released in July. That was supposed to release back in May, if I recall, but then the Chinese Chamber of Commerce in Zambia, they filed a court suit against it, and there was this big brouhaha about it. Interestingly, it hasn't really generated the kind of buzz that I would have expected, say, 5-10 years ago, a documentary that was this hard-hitting, this critical of the Chinese. So far, weeks after it's been released, only 74,000 views on YouTube, which is really not much for this kind of documentary. They have claimed a little bit of credit, though, this week, and just I want to get your take on this as well, where there was the suspension of two Chinese-run mines in the Kasempa district for illegal processing of gold and copper. And again, it's just put more attention on this documentary's put more attention on the role of illegal Chinese mining in Zambia. They asked the question, and this was the real thrust of the documentary, was partly about the Chinese, but also the lack of governance from the Zambian government. And News Diggers this week, in an article entitled Chinese Investment in Zambia, What's Left to Say? And they raised the questions about these two Chinese mines that were suspended. What type of licenses do these mining companies have? How did they get these licenses without satisfying the environmental impact assessment requirements? Why is it that the government only discovers when it's already too late and the damage has already been done? Here's this frustration, Géraud, that we hear from Zambian media. We've heard this from Congolese NGOs and civil society, certainly in Zimbabwe as well, about the governance, not only of Chinese mines, but all mines. And it's been a frustrating part, but you see here a very vibrant press in Zambia really pressuring the government to take action.
Yeah, we see that a lot. And Zambia has really become that space where you have media that are really present, really trying to create a space of accountability, of transparency, of getting all the stakeholders to talk. And it's really something encouraging, given that we see in many African countries, not many media have those space to be able to create space for communication, for conversation, to put things, difficult things on the table. Even a country that's still democratic like Kenya, but there is a shrinking of freedom of media, where media cannot be speaking the way Zambia has released a media like this. Now in Kenya, you'd assume a lot of pressure coming from the government to tell you not to do it. But here in Zambia, they went to court, they won, and they were been able to release the news story. And for me, it's something very encouraging into that space of China engagement in Africa and the media, where we do have a lot of noise, a lot of things, where we also do have a lot of China trying to influence media spaces in African countries. So when you have a country where we still have free media that can pose the hard question, the hard truth, it's very something that we really need about that. And what I really loved in the News Digger report, they were really also pointing fingers at the government, asking them, as you mentioned, why are we seeing that? Why do we see those kind of things keep on happening? Why those people do not have all the proper document?
Well, all this discussion about media and the framing of stories, particularly around China, got us thinking that it'd be great for us to dive in a little bit more into this particular topic. And there was a fascinating paper that came out last November, and the timing of this release of this paper is going to be interesting for our discussion today. Zambia's Media Perspective on China, the US, Japan, and South Africa, Comparative Exploration Through Private Online Media. It was written by Natsuko Imai Kanayama, who is a research officer at the JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development in the fascinating, wonderful neighborhood of Shinjuku in Tokyo, where she joins us today on the program. A very good afternoon to you, Natsuko-san.
Hi, very good afternoon to Eric, and good morning to Thank you very much for having me here today.
It's so wonderful to have you here and to be able to talk about this massive study that you did, where you looked at private online media perspectives and bilateral relations with China, Japan, the US, and South Africa. Again, it's very important to note that you did the research in 2024, before Donald Trump took office, and we're going to talk about that, maybe how some things have changed. But let's just start with, again, we talked about this News Diggers and that documentary about China, but maybe just start about what you were trying to achieve with this study and how you went about doing it.
Okay, all right. So thank you very much for this opportunity. So to explain about my media study in Zambia, I'd like to briefly introduce the umbrella project that this media study is a part of, which has been undertaken since 2022. The project, the title must be interesting for you. The Dynamics of Peace and Development in the Indo-Pacific. The subtitle is How Countries in the Region Proactively Interact with China. Yeah. So the main research question or objective of this umbrella project is to examine how the so-called smaller countries or developing countries in the region are exercising their own agency to build the bilateral relations between China. Yeah. And then under this umbrella project, we looked at the case countries of the Philippines, Laos, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Uzbekistan, Serbia, and Zambia.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Zambia, really an outlier there compared to
Yeah.
other
Exactly.
Indo-Pacific countries.
Yes, exactly. So the Indo-Pacific concept, is very flexible. If you want to use for the economic discussion, you cannot describe the certain area to focus. But if you want to discuss broader geopolitics, we can use like Djibouti, Zambia, Tanzania, even the Seychelles. Yeah. So, and for me, under this umbrella project, I got an interest looking at how the local media of these countries are looking at the dynamics of the global powers competition. Yes. So the main motivation behind my research project, my media research, is to examine to challenge the global mainstreamed narratives with the idea that the smaller states is in a position to just perceive any circumstances given by the global competition, right? Or another idea is smaller countries tend to be caught in a debt trap. Yeah.
Ooh,
And
okay.
yeah.
Gotta watch out for that
Yes.
word. We'll come back to that.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I know. Debt trap is a very important key word for this podcast, definitely. So, to challenge this global narrative, I decided to look at the local media's perspective. Yeah, and if my first case was a Bangladesh, and this Zambia case is my second case, and currently I'm working on the cases of Laos and Sri Lanka to compare the media coverage of these four countries. Yes. Okay. So, and the major findings of my research project to explain the main findings, I'd like to use three angles. The first angle is about the commonality across the four big states. For the case of Zambia, I use China, Japan, US, and South Africa. And then just for your information, for the case of Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, I used India as a regional bigger powers. And for the case of Laos, I used Thailand. And why I used this presence of the regional powers in this argument is that Umbrella Project developed the original analytical framework, which is called five-factor model. So basically, this analytical framework is to examine how the smaller country is trying to exercise the agency to build the better bilateral relationship between China. And these five elements is a domestic politics. Yeah. And the second one is a economy, including development. And the third one is a peace and security. And the fourth one is global international relations. And the fifth one is regional international relations. So one of the characteristics of this analytical framework is to add the essence of the regional international relations and independent. And having that aspect of the regional international relations, it helped us to analyze the complexities of the geopolitics that the smaller states is facing. And that regional context is very different from the region to region. In the South Asia, India is too powerful. And for Southeast Asian countries, Thailand, Vietnam are very important. And for the case of Zambia, I looked at the South Africa because the bilateral relationship between Zambia and the South Africa, very
important. Very quickly, what was the methodology that you're using for all of these countries to be able to collect this? And we want to not spend too much time on that because we have so many other questions we want to get to about the outcomes.
All right. So about the methodology of my media study, I used the mixed methods, combination of the quantitative approach and the qualitative approach. For the quantitative part, I used the text mining using the free software, which is called KH Coder, and applying the analysis of the most frequently used keywords and the co-occurrence network for the quantitative part. But for the qualitative part, I collected the sample articles, 644 sample articles from the internet, and I undertook the discourse analysis based on the 5-factor model.
Okay. I see that in your research, you went about to look into private media and only private media. So I was really curious to say, why didn't you include public media in your coverage? Is it a perception that public media are already biased in a certain sense, or what was the reasoning behind only going for private media?
Okay, thank you very much for the good question. And partially, your perception is correct. So as an JICA, so we are very, very careful about the bias, especially the media. And when we're talking about the media, the first step that we have to consider is the level or degree of the bias. If whether this media is pro-government or anti-government, and of course, if we choose like a pro government media, then our analysis could be biased, right? So because the purpose of this media is to try to not to examine whether the government is exercising the agency or not, but rather I was more interested in how the media is publishing the government's bilateral relationship with the bigger states. That is why I have chosen more like a middle space media.
When you look into that, because you use two specific media in your report to kind of cover, I think it was Zambian let me find the correct name just to make sure I don't want to butcher the name. You got two media specifically into when you were covering that. It was like Mwebantu and Daily Nation. So in your assessment, you really come to the conclusion that those two media were fairly in the middle and not into leaning toward either the opposition or to the government. Because sometimes when it comes to media, given how media are struggling in many African countries, media tends to become much more dependent on either, certain political angle based on media subscription, based on financial support. So you chose those two media on the assessment that they were fairly in the middle, or you chose them in a sense where because of the readership or because of how big they are, or what was the factors that really took you on those two media specifically, not the remaining ones?
Okay, so basically for this media study, because I was addressing 4 countries, right? So I need to develop the certain criteria, which is to be applied to the 4 countries. Yeah. And then there are 3 criteria. One criteria is they should be one of the leading media with a larger readership. So I tried to figure out the size of the readership in Zambia using a different source of the information. And the Mwebantu and Daily Nation had a quite larger readership. Yep. And the second criteria is free accessibility.
Okay.
Yeah, free accessibility, and the Mwebantu was mostly free. And the Daily Nation, they are basically free, but they require subscription fee for certain articles. Yes, but even for that articles which require the subscription fee, kindly, Daily Nation provided the outline and the essence of the articles, so that I could use. And the third criteria is English one. Yeah. And fortunately for the Zambia, official language is English, so I did not have a problem to choose the movement and delineation, unlike other country cases. But basically, it is of course very challenging to determine or making a decision, the position of this 2 media platform. Yeah, because this is another area of the argument about the freedom of the media in Zambia. As you may know, there are lots of arguments, right? So, but after looking at the various media platforms of the Zambia, I decided to choose the Weibo and Daily Nation to position these two platforms and not to middle per se, but not too pro-government, not too anti-government. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's dive into some of the findings in the report. Again, you covered so many countries, and we won't have time to go through all of the countries. This is, of course, the China in Africa podcast, so it'd be interesting to hear what were your findings related to China.
Okay, all right. So relating to China, okay, this is very interesting. But first of all, across the 4 countries, including China, the Zambia's media's major concern was a very, very common economic growth and bringing for more foreign direct investment. And China is one of them. Japan also, US, South Africa also. That was a commonality. Then the second aspect is country-specific focuses. Then it comes to the China. So when it comes to China, the major agenda was, of course, debt issue, debt restriction. Because of the period that I subjected some articles between 2016 to 2023, the argument on the debt restructuring was very, very heavy. So that was a major essence on the media coverage about the China. But contrary to that, Japan, US, South Africa had a different characteristic. And although you mentioned about China, maybe sharing the characteristic or country-specific focus of the Zambian media on these 3 countries could be helpful to understand the characteristic of the media coverage on China. For example, Japan. Investment, private sector investment. That was a major expectation of the Zambian media and also the Zambian government. But at the same time, after analyzing the discourse, there was a clear that there's a huge gap between Zambia and Japan. So that Zambia expect further direct investment from Japan, but there's a very clear hesitation or difficulty that Japan cannot enter aggressively because of the lot of challenges that Japan has. And for the U.S., maybe this point could be related to the discussion later. So during this time scope that I addressed, the major argument was about the LGBTQ human rights because of the Biden administration's
So that's the old administration, right? And
Yes,
just
that
to
old
pick
one.
up on what Géraud was talking about earlier about the difficulties that the Zambian government has had with U.S. embassies. In fact, during the Edgar Lungu administration, they expelled the U.S. ambassador over LGBTQ plus issues. So this has been a sticking point. Now, to be very clear, the Trump administration has made it absolutely 100% a break with the Biden administration on this issue, and those types of LGBTQ plus issues and environment and aid no longer a priority. It's all about trade, and it's all about deals. So very big difference between the Biden and the Trump. Sorry to interrupt you there, Natsuko-san.
No, it's okay. And then the last one is South Africa. So as you know, the South Africa is in a very special position for Zambia. And even in articles, there are repeatedly highlighted historical ties between Zambia and South Africa. Even the former president of Lung and the current president Hichilema, they clearly emphasize the very special relationship between South Africa. But now they are spotlighting that this historically important bilateral relationship between Zambia and South Africa have to be elevated to the further strong economic and the trade relationship. That was a highlight that I found out in terms of the country-specific focus. Then the third angle that I wanted to share as a result of my research is the 5-factor model angles. As I mentioned, I used the 5-factor model analytical framework, right? So for the domestic politics, so Zambia media highlights the debate over China and the U.S. relations linking to the political party competition very strongly. And for that political confrontation, the discussion and the argument on the human rights and the LGBTQ agenda was used as a political tool.
Can you dig a bit on that element there? How that domestic policy in terms of like how they covered China and US and all those LGBTQ really were played out into those two media? How the coverage was different and how did they took that angle?
Okay, so for the Miliband Daily Nation, they did not show their position, of course. They are broadcasting the reality and the fact of the statement that ministers argue like this. The other politician, opposition leader counter-argued like this. So the media coverage was to highlight this political confrontation over the agenda of the LGBTQ. But from the media discourse, I did not realize that there are any specific position of the media over the LGBTQ issue.
Okay. Yeah. So because I wanted to understand how in that perception of the US-China relationship, relating to domestic priority, national domestic priority, how they perceived at the end China's influence or US influence within how those two countries were responding to the domestic priority of Zambia. Do you have the sense that they have either a positive or negative coverage of one of the two countries regarding Zambia domestic priorities?
Oh, from the side of the China and the US?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. So from the China side, I am very sure that the China is trying to fulfill the priorities of the Zambia, because I believe that the China understand that the fulfilling of the Zambia's need is very essential, wanted to keep the bilateral relationship between Zambia and China, right? Because Zambia and China also had very special historical ties going back to the time of the independence, and definitely the presence of the Tazara is very special, right? And not unfortunately, but interestingly, after the presidential election in 2021, the a nuanced approach to the China has been changed, as you may know, right? And then the China, there was not any the clear text in the media, but following the publication of the media articles and the type of the stories that the media published, I felt that China was looking at keeping a certain moderate distance to look at the current president Hichilema. Yes, and interestingly, of course, traditionally, the Zambia president, after presidential election, the first country to visit outside Africa must be China. And then it was like that. Okay, and immediately they visited China. But the current president Chelema, he did not visit China, but instead he went to US, right? I'm very sure you have argued already in the different districts, right? So then, after couple of months, then President Hichilema made a phone call to
President Xi Jinping. Yes.
Exactly. And then it was after 2 years after he became the president to visit China for the first time. Yes. So even during that 2 years, that I feel that China was not showing a clear signing to be hostile or to be suspicious about the new administration. They feel that China was keeping a certain distance to look at how the current president taken necessary action.
And just to be fair there, in his first visit to Washington, it was on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, so it was not an official trip. And he never got to see Biden. He was relegated to the vice president. So again, and the word on the street back then was that Biden did not want to see Hichilema because of these LGBTQ plus issues that the base of the Democratic Party thought was very important. So again, we saw both of the big powers kind of keeping their distance a little bit from Hichilema, even though Hichilema at the time was considered to be very much a role model for the kind of leader that the Americans wanted in terms of really coming to power on a youth vote, on women, on inclusivity, and things like that. It's interesting that you focused on kind of mainstream traditional media, in part because Zambia has a very robust, like everywhere in Africa, given the fact that there's such a young population. Most people are on social media, and interestingly enough, that over the years that we've been covering China Africa, many of the anti-China memes that have been very durable have come out of Zambia. In fact, there was one about 10 years ago that the Chinese were exporting human meat. I don't know if you remember this one in cans. That was a meme that came out of Zambia. There was another one where there was a very violent video of what looked like Chinese people beating up an African individual. It turns out those were Malaysians in Malaysia, and it had nothing to do with Chinese, but it was a meme that came out of Zambia as well. Zambia, so on the one hand, you had these narratives that you identified, very conventional mainstream narratives about infrastructure and about debt and about kind of great power competitions. Meantime, outside of that, on social media and in the informal media, you have a lot of focus on Chinese labor practices, Chinese mining issues, Chinese merchants. Remember, there was a whole drama a couple of years ago about racism against Zambians in Chinese stores and things like that. That didn't come up. It seemed to come up in your research too much. These more, provocative memes. You got very conventional mainstream memes.
Exactly. This time I focus on the official newspaper company and the platform. Yes, because social media is a totally different world. Yes, and I cannot combine the both media to make like a integrated analysis. I think it is very, very difficult to do that. And because having the mainstream or traditional media analysis, then I think it will be useful to focus on the social media analysis at a different level, so that I think we can get a more diversified perspective.
That's right, a more holistic picture of what the situation is. Yes. Very quickly, did anything surprise you in the findings? So especially when you look at Zambia in relation to some of the other countries in Asia Pacific that you're looking at, did anything in the Zambia-China research that you did again stand out, being different from what you're seeing in Asia?
Okay, so I think as like a new learning, I never imagined how the Zambia and China had a strong relationship going back to the time of independence. And I never imagined how the Tazara is important for the Zambians' identity. So probably this is just complementary information. So while I was staying in Zambia for my research, I went to the one shopping mall food court. And I was shopping in one lunch box and eating alone on the table. Then very old gentleman came to my table and he also started having the dishes. Then we started chatting. Then he told me that he has been to Japan as a diplomat a long time ago. And we talking about Japan, we talking about China, but even that retired Zambian diplomats signified that China's support of Tazara, because he experienced that all the time of the country, right? So then I realized that, the importance of the Tazara and the Tazara's contribution to the Zambia-China relationship. Oh, this is very, very essential to understand even today's China-Zambia relationship. Yep. And because of that historical, importance, I was very convinced that the current president, Shlema, is playing very good balancing diplomacy. Yes, that is my impression compared with the other president in the different African countries.
Your studies,
despite the criticism from the opposition party, he's also trying. Yeah.
your study comes after the one you did in Bangladesh. You are still going to do another study in Laos and other Indo-Pacific in Indo-Pacific country. Looking into how you saw media coverage of China in Bangladesh and also the coverage of China media in Zambia, have you seen any parallels, like commonalities or differences that can be that you can draw lesson from so far?
Sure, okay. Commonality was there between Bangladesh and Zambia. That was money. That was economic investment, economic development. right? And then, interestingly, the Bangladesh, their national target was to become a trade hub, invest hub, infrastructure hub in the region, in the South region. And then Zambia's national goal was to become a trade hub for the Southern Africa. So having that similar target, the message toward China was very clear. Not only China, even to Japan, even in the US. Yeah. Economic aspect was a very, very important commonality for these two countries. And interesting contrast between these two countries was the meaning or the presence of the regional power. So for the Bangladesh, India was very, very, very important regional power. So historically, they had the difficulty to keep the moderate and the friendly relationship. But even the Bangladesh, after I published the paper, there was a government change, right? Well, I have to talk about the previous Hasina administration, but Hasina administration tried to improve the bilateral relationship between India, even feeling a threat. But still, on the surface of the diplomacy, she was trying to be closer to India because India was threat. Yes, but Zambia, interestingly, there is no severe security concern. So, as I mentioned, the third element of the five-factor model was a peace and the security. So, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, they have the security threats. Even Serbia, they have it. No, Philippines, now they have it. But only Zambia did not have security threats. Yeah, exactly. Only daily crime, or at a certain point, there was no concern on a truck drivers' attack due to the xenophobia in South Africa, but there was no security concern. So the main difference between the Bangladesh and the Zambia was the type of the regional bigger countries. Apparently, for Zambia, South Africa was a very, very good partner. But for the different case countries, regional powers was perceived as a threat. And then how the smaller country look at the regional powers will influence how the smaller countries exercise agency toward bigger states like China.
Interesting.
That aspect became clear because of having a different aspect of the global international relations and the regional international relations.
Interesting to compare and contrast again between Asia and Zambia and these countries, and very, very interesting. If you want to take a look at the report, we're going to put the link to it in the show notes. Zambia's media perspective on China, the U.S., Japan, and South Africa. Remember, the U.S. part was done last year before Donald Trump, but still fascinating. Comparative exploration through private online media. It was written by Natsuko Imai Kanayama, who is a research officer at the Japan International Cooperation Agency, Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development in Tokyo, joining us today from beautiful Shinjuku, lively Shinjuku. Thank you so much, Natsuko, for your time and for your insights and for this fascinating paper. I'm hoping that a lot of people will look at it because it's very important, especially this comparison that you're doing. So really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure to have a discussion with you. Thank you so much.
Géraud, what I found so interesting was the comparison between media in Asia and Zambia. And I'd like to see more of that to see if there are parallels and what stark differences there are. Obviously, the security angle is one that's going to come up quite a bit, particularly with India and things like that, and countries like the Philippines. But there probably are quite a bit of similarities in terms of debt and infrastructure, US-China competition. So this is a really interesting vector that I hope that more researchers are going to look at.
Exactly. That's why I loved it. That's why I mentioned that I loved the paper in a sense where, as I was saying, it really reflects on what we do ourselves, China Global South. And you see someone say, I want to see how China is covered in those different regions, understanding that the way China is covered in one part is definitely part of a larger of a larger umbrella, of a larger approach on China is looking into. So yes, definitely I like that comparison. That's why I'm really looking for the next iteration of a research, kind of looking to see how we see the differences, because it's really important. Because I do believe as much as China approach the global south on a larger approach, with a larger strategic approach, I also do believe that it generates and it creates a similarities in the way China is covered. in those regions. And I'm not surprised that, as she say, the common point, like in Bangladesh, in Zambia, it was money, economic development. When it comes to China, they were talking about it, because when you look into how China engaged in those countries, we see those elements being upfront. And that was really interesting, because I was like, okay, we see those commonalities, and of course the difference is going to come up based on internal domestic and regional dynamics. That's why I'm not really surprised that India was picked up there. And I haven't read a paper on Bangladesh, but I'm quite curious to see if the rivalry between China and India kind of played out into the newspapers. Are they covering the issue of China in Bangladesh?
Last year, in 24, when she was doing that, we would have seen quite a bit of that China-India rivalry. This year, it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
One thing that we've been covering quite a bit here at CGSP, particularly this past week, is to see a number of new deals that the Chinese have signed. These are called content sharing agreements, CSAs, and they've done 2 in Kenya over the past couple of weeks. One with Capital FM, which is a major portal and news site and a radio station, and the other with the Star newspaper. And now they call these content sharing agreements, but content is really going one way, not both ways. And what it means is that you're seeing Xinhua and China Daily content being pumped into these publications, and it's a very important part of how China shapes the narrative in African countries. And by the way, it's not only in Africa, they do this around the world, including in the US and Europe and everywhere else. But there's been 2 deals of note in Kenya in particular, and we didn't have a chance to get into it with her, but traditional media is oftentimes influenced by these deals, and these deals give the Chinese considerable leverage, because we have evidence, and a number of scholars have documented this, that when a publication that has a content sharing agreement with the Chinese wants to publish a letter from the U.S. ambassador, or talk about Xinjiang, or talk about Taiwan, or talk about a sensitive issue, the Chinese embassy is very quick to intervene to say, listen, if you publish that, we're going to pull our contract. And it does have an ability to influence the way that China is covered in many of these countries, in part because the national media, these private media outlets, are under very, very difficult duress right now, given the market for media. And that's not uniquely an African problem. That's an every media problem, including us and everybody else. And so it's interesting to think about how the narratives that she reflected in her research were also influenced by the Chinese themselves, who have been very effective in shaping those stories.
Yes, that's really interesting to see. That's why I was asking the question, why she picked those 2, given the currency circumstances and current financial constraint that many of those medias are facing. But I don't know if those 2 media are receiving, they're sharing a content sharing agreement with China, with Chinese entities. But beside Chinese content agreement, we also have those subscriptions, those also, the ads that Chinese companies run on those 2 media. That's really a major source of revenue for many media on the ground. So I really don't know to what extent there was this kind of influence appearing, and I didn't think that she captured that in the research. When I don't think
she captured that.
She captured that, and that would be interesting to see. That would be interesting to see.
Capital FM. Sorry to interrupt you. On the Capital FM website now, and I encourage you to go check it out, capitalfm.kenya. You can see there is a part that says China Daily, and there it is, right there. All the China Daily content is showing up.
Yeah. Now they're doing that because, as I don't want to defend. I don't think I don't even think if there is something to defend or not. But people are gonna tell you, media needs to survive. They need to find source of revenues, and they're trying as much as possible to get what they want to get. But at the end, it's about now the future of free media, or free. I won't say free speech, but free media, unbiased media in that space. And I remember in the case of Capital FM, and even in the case of the Star, by the way, they were saying that the director was defending the fact that we are using, we are giving space to those to China to Xinhua to be able to share the content on our website, because we want to create a space of like balanced news coverage around China in Africa, something like that. So they're always finding.
Listen, you're not going to get balanced coverage with China Daily and Xinhua. That is from the point of view of the government. There's pure and simple.
Yes,
It's
we had
just
a
the
different
point of view
reading
of
on
the
what it
government.
meant, but yes, that
I mean,
was the
that
idea.
is what it is. It's not an independent media organization with independent
Yeah, of
journalists.
course
And
not.
and again, they're doing their job to promote China's view of the world, but it is not an independent view. Very quickly before we go, and we just have to wrap up, I do want to get your take on the drama this past week that came out of Washington when U.S. Senator from Texas, Ted Cruz, publicly declared his support for Somaliland recognition by the U.S. government. This prompted the Chinese embassy in Somalia to denounce it. The Chinese Foreign Ministry in Beijing spoke out on it. A lot of talk on X about this issue. What's your take on all of this?
It's the momentum. It's a momentum. We've seen that since the new administration arrived. We're even speculating about that. That's going to be a moment where you're going to see the call for independence for Somaliland to ramp up, because we already had signals from the former administration. There were people that really, I wouldn't say lobbying, but those really working hard into getting Somaliland momentum into DC, where Somaliland has, Somaliland can become an independent country. China's reaction, not surprising. China facing the same context with Taiwan, with other independentist movement around China, and we saw that China reiterated its support for one Somali policy, and they've been, the two countries have been working. They've been kind of working together into the narrative of one country, one single country. So I'm not really surprised that China came out strong on that. I think it was really about to provide Somali with the support that needed, because in the current circumstances, when Ted Cruz goes on saying something like that, if nobody talks, and given how many African countries now are folding and bending to the U.S. administration, whims and agenda, you have the feeling that a country like Somalia can feel that I'm alone. No one's gonna speak for me if no one in that kind of situation. And China had to come out to say, no, we are against those kind of policy, reiterating their support of one Somali, which kind of also reflect to Beijing's own interest in terms of like one China policy.
So I just offer my American friends in Washington who are getting very excited about this and saying this is how we're going to stick it to the Chinese communists by recognizing Somaliland, that there is another side of this story that they may want to consider. Because if Somaliland does want to get international recognition at the United Nations, it is going to need China's support. Otherwise, it will not get past the UN Security Council. China will veto it right away.
It's also going to need the basic support of African countries, and so far there's not much of a support for
African
Somaliland
countries,
independent Somaliland
Géraud,
in
that
Africa.
doesn't matter. That doesn't matter if at the UN, because at the end of the day, China has a veto at the UN, and it will just block it. And so if it wants to get recognition at the United Nations, where it needs to get full international recognition, getting the U.S. is one thing, but getting recognized by the UN is a totally different thing. One thing that we did a show on Somaliland a couple months ago, and one thing that came out was from these analysts was that they may trade in Taiwan for China to get the support at the UN. And so as part of a deal, they'll say to the Chinese, listen, we will cashier our relationship if that is what will give us your consent to get recognition at the UN. It's a possibility.
I don't really believe. I don't really believe that to be a real bargain to put on the table because of importance, because of how relevant Somaliland and Taiwan are to the international system or to those countries at the one hand.
Then there's no international recognition for Somaliland.
So
Full
I
stop.
don't really, I
It
really
doesn't go
don't
anywhere.
so I don't really see how you are ready to bargain Taiwan for Somaliland. I don't see that happening.
It depends how badly they want international recognition. And if they don't have China's support, then they don't get international recognition.
But I don't think in the US there's that much of support for independence of Somaliland to say we're gonna put the country of Nvidia or all those chip makers on the balance. I don't think so.
Well, yeah, just bear in mind that the last time the United States shepherded in a new African country, which was South Sudan, it was disastrous. So we have very short attention spans in the United States. So a year or two. But this story's not over with U.S. recognition. It has to go the next step if Somaliland wants to eventually be recognized as a full country. And in order to do that, it will have to come to some sort of accommodation with China. And at this point, the only card that they have on the table is Taiwan.
And I
to
mentioned
give up their relationship with
And I
Taiwan.
mentioned African countries because China position at the UN will also depend on how African countries are standing on that. If African countries say we're supporting that, China will not just block it at the Security Council because on the continent, African countries agree with that. But
I tell you,
if there's a strong opposition,
could
it's
not
China-
disagree with you
Yeah.
more. 100%. Taiwan comes above every African country.
Oh yes, that's true. That's true.
Full stop.
Just to say that China opposition to Somaliland independence at the UN will very much depend on how African countries are taking that question first.
Yeah. So anyway, it's going to be an interesting story on Somaliland, one that we're covering quite closely along with the media stories. We've been covering the content sharing agreements. There's really nobody else out there that's doing this type of coverage in both English and in French. Géraud is running all of these stories in French at Projet Afrique Chine. This is groundbreaking work to be able to do this in both languages and with the level of detail that we're doing it at every single day. There's really, again, no other resource that's dedicating this many people to covering what Chinese engagement looks like in Africa from all sides: media, economics, military, culture, politics, great power rivalries, all of these different things, Somaliland. And so I encourage you to go check out the great work that Géraud and the team are doing at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. And your support is so important to us on Patreon, through the donations that we've been getting off the website, and then also for your subscriptions. If you'd like to subscribe, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Subscriptions are very affordable. And also, if you are a student, I always say this at the end of the show, and I always find out how many people are listening all the way until the end of the show by how many students we get, and teachers as well, to sign up. And we really appreciate all of our academic supporters. We'll send you a half-off discount for a subscription if you email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, ERIC@ChinaGlobalSouth.com. So that'll do it for this edition of the show. Géraud, Cobus, myself, and the rest of the team will be back next week for another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening and watching. Bye.